So welcome everybody to the special Arizona Regional Conference edition of Exploring the World of Open Education, a workshop series in 7 parts that the Maricopa OER project has been delivering now for a few years. We are excited to have you today. This is the first workshop in the 7-part series. If you do end up attending all 7 of the workshops, you can earn a Maricopa Millions OER practitioner certification, which comes with a nifty little digital badge and I guess bragging rights to some extent. Today's workshop is called What Open Means, and it's a pretty ambitious title. The history, philosophy, practice, and future of OER is quite a bit, but what we wanted to do is try to start off this seminar series by looking at a variety of different approaches to open education. And throughout the 7-part series that runs concurrent to a lot of other programming for this conference, you'll see that we're trying to address specific aspects of open education little by little throughout that all 7 of the workshops. So I would also like to say down at the bottom right here, you'll see that there is a URL to a Canvas workshop. It occurs to me only in this moment right now that I neglected to put a public link there. So everyone who's in attendance right now, I'll make sure to get that list and send you out a link to a public version of that, because that's the Maricopa Canvas instance. But there is a public version of an OER workshop course that you can use for general reference or whatever. It's actually on Canvas Commons. If you went and searched it, you could download it and use the materials, because as you can see, they're all openly licensed. So one important bit of housekeeping is that this and the other workshops in the Open Education Workshop Series, which we're calling an OER Starter Seminar Series as part of the conference, each is available individually for faculty professional growth. This one today is 1.5 hours. There is an evaluation and assessment form that has been shared with you, and it's on the website that you can find in order to fill that out within the next 24 hours to if you're intending to apply for FPG. And of course, you have to submit the application to your college representative in the end. And if you have questions about FPG, you can always reach out to me. I'll let you know. So starting off, the one thing that I like to do at the beginning of these workshops is provide you with a few suggested readings. The one at the top there is a book of articles written by a variety of voices in open education from a variety of perspectives. So it's a really good complement to this workshop series, which kind of tries to do the same thing by bringing in a lot of different perspectives and trying to understand open education as a nebula of practices, rather than as like a single monolithic thing that's happening. And then second, you can see there's the CARE framework. I will address this explicitly towards the end today, but in short, it's an article that was written a couple of years ago that helps to, or that proposes to address some of the challenges that are emerging as open education becomes a more standardized kind of discipline, if that's even the right word to use. And then below that, you'll see a link to the Creative Commons resources that are associated with the certificate program they have. So, and I'll talk in more detail about that in a couple minutes as well. But of course, these are all openly licensed, and I encourage you to check them out if you would like complimentary review. And so here we go. I will say that, you know, the title of this workshop is What Open Means. And I wanted to kind of preface the whole thing by saying, like, I don't really presume to know what open means. I think that there are a lot of different ways that people interpret you know, the word open in an educational context, or if we're talking about sharing knowledge, or if we're talking about, you know, liberation versus just, you know, free stuff, I guess. So there's a lot of different approaches to it, and one of the ways that I kind of like to stress what's happening with open education, or one approach to it, is that it is a suite of values. It's not necessarily just saving students money, as important as that is. I think that we can all agree that saving students money is a big deal, especially when we have a lot of students who are, you know, just like a lot of other humans right now, having issues with, you know, financial issues, dealing with all kinds of problems brought about by the pandemic and other things as well. So saving students money is important, but when we think about open education, there are all these other these other characteristics and behaviors that are associated with what that actually means. Like, what are we trying to do? And you can see here some of these values. I think you'll see reflected in some of the discussions we're having today. If you were present at the keynote this morning, certainly you can see that Jasmine Roberts addressed some of this stuff as well. And so I think that this is always an important thing to stress, is that we are looking at an entire suite of values. It's not just about the important task of saving student money. So let's talk a little bit about what open educational resources are, and talk a little bit about definitions. And there are a lot of, again, ways that we can approach the concept of open education, but one of the things that I think is very important to consider is distinguishing between open and free. There are a lot of things in the world that are free, I guess, to some extent, although maybe some economists would disagree with me, but certainly stuff on the internet you don't have to pay for a lot of the time. You know, there's all kinds of free resources, freely accessible articles and things like that that you can find access to. But when we talk about open educational resources, we're specifically talking about a set of materials that are either available under an open content sharing license, like those developed by Creative Commons, or materials that are in the public domain, which means that nobody owns the copyright to them, so you can use them however you want. And these materials could be anything from an individual image to a whole textbook or course or test banks, pretty much any element, any individual instance of intellectual property that happens to be available under one of those kinds of licenses. In fact, I even, you know, oftentimes will say that the term open educational resources is itself kind of misleading, because it might make one think that the education aspect is central to what open content is and open licensing is all about. The truth is that it just so happens that as educators, we're using openly licensed materials in an educational context, so we call them open educational resources. But as just normal humans, if you find Creative Commons licensed content online or content that's in the public domain, you are free to use those according to the permissions afforded by the licenses for whatever purposes you want. It doesn't have to be educational. It can be personal, it can be professional, it can be a business, it can be creative, artistic, whatever. So, and that's kind of what we'll talk about here in a little bit. But before I go to that detail about what, you know, kind of the reasoning behind free culture and the open education connection to that is, I wanted to talk very briefly about the 5 R's. So the idea is, with open educational resources, the licensing permits the 5 R's, which are the rights to, you know, redistribute the work, I should say the permission to retain the work, the permission to reuse, and then also to remix works and to revise works to improve their content or whatever, localize the content, globalize the content, whatever purpose might be. So these are all permissions that really increase the amount of freedom that people in the academic community have when it comes to customizing their materials, controlling the content that they think is going to be best for their students, keeping a copy of the content so that the content doesn't disappear when whoever's hosting it decides that they want to get rid of it or put a paywall up or whatever the case may be. So we can see the 5 R's not just as this is great because you can remix stuff, but it's really an academic freedom issue in many ways as well. And so this is definitely from the kind of content creator side right now. And as we continue down that path a little bit, I just want to talk briefly about how open education fits into the larger kind of free culture movement, specifically when it comes to the use of these open licenses and whatnot. And again, this is relatively limited. This is really just looking at specifically the relationship between what the discipline of open education and the free culture movement that kind of emerged in the 90s, I would say, with open source software and other forms of sharing brought about by the internet. I mean, the internet basically, as I probably don't need to explain to you all, completely changed the way that humans share information, making it in many ways democratizing the act of sharing and generating knowledge. And the way in which digital information sharing makes possible remixing and redistribution without traditional gatekeepers, it kind of made copyright kind of broken in a sense, or not necessarily broken, but it really called into question like the standard kind of concept of Western copyright, which is, that copyright is automatic. At least that's how it has been interpreted since the Berne Convention in the late 19th century. And there are other details, in specific countries and things like that. But the idea is that like when you create something, you automatically have all the rights reserved to that content. And the kind of problem with that, or at least the argument is that the problem with that is that it is overly restrictive, especially in a context where digital information sharing is ubiquitous, and most of what people do online is potentially could potentially, well, first of all, most of what people do online is publication, self-publication, whether it's on Instagram or whether it's your Twitter, or whether it is a meme that you're making and sharing, YouTube videos, whatever the case may be. People are generating content all the time, and it's really, really easy to infringe on other people's copyrights, but in ways that might not necessarily be harmful. And in fact, the argument is that it's stifling creativity when these restrictive copyright laws are in place. So Creative Commons is a nonprofit organization that was founded back in 2001. It's kind of part of this larger movement towards advocating for some rights reserved from licensing, which basically is a way for content intellectual property rights holders to give a blanket permission to everyone in the world and say, in advance, you can use this material, you can reuse it, you can revise it, according to these specific restrictions or whatever. And those permissions that are granted, the argument goes, actually do help to support creativity and make a more vibrant community, generally speaking. Now that's in a nutshell, and there's a lot of interesting history involved with that, and there are a lot of educational and cultural practices that precede this that we could also look at in terms of contextualizing open education. But I did want to share with you, because Creative Commons is something that you will find referenced throughout most discussions of open educational resources specifically and throughout this series. And so I wanted to encourage you to check out the Creative Commons, well, go to their website, first of all, if you're not familiar with it. There's tons of resources on there. They have a license builder. You can do a search for Creative Commons licensed material. But specifically the URL here is a really great way to basically get the history, the story of Creative Commons and the practice of the licensing and the use of the licenses and those kinds of things straight from the organization that has developed these tools. And I would also say, and this is not like a shameless plug, I think it's relevant, but we also have the 2 upcoming workshops in this starter seminar series are next week on Wednesday and Thursday, I believe. And they are focused, the first one specifically on copyright and getting into the details of copyright, and the second one specifically about openly licensed content and Creative Commons. So in order to get into more detail about that stuff, getting into the weeds, as they say, that's the title of one of the workshops, then please join us for that, because we have a very qualified expert on copyright to come join us and kind of share some wisdom and experience with respect to that stuff. So having said all that, like I kind of said before I went into this whole thing about Creative Commons, this is very much from like the creator side of things, right? Or from the educator side, because if you're the educator curating content or involving students in that curation as well, even, you're still kind of like looking at this as, oh, I'm creating this, I can put a license on it, or I've seen what people can use. And so it's all about creativity and sharing that information. But it is still really important for us to consider the very real the practical application, in a sense, of open education, and how this comes out of a larger movement towards affordability in higher education and student activism in general. And so we have a very special guest with us today who I am happy to invite to take over here. It's Kaylin Nagel. She's the Affordable Textbooks Campaign Director at Student PIRGs, which is part of US PIRG. And Kaylin, it's all yours. Take it away and just let me know, and I'll go through the slides at your cue.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be back here. like you said, my name is Kayla Nagel. I'm the Affordable Textbooks Campaign Director with US PIRG. I got my start as a campus organizer in 2016 with the student PIRGs on the UCLA campus. I spent 3 years as a community organizer in Southern California at UCLA and UC Riverside, working with students on issues ranging from helping them register to vote to renewable energy on campus, and of course, passing open textbook policies, which was my favorite campaign. It was something I was really passionate about. So when I had the chance to join the national team and take over the campaign from the top, I jumped on it. So you can go to the next slide and then just skip that one and go to the one with the old picture. So the student PIRGs stand for the Public Interest Research Group. We were founded by students in the 1970s. And the idea is that students kind of looked at the problems facing the country and saw that there were a lot of solutions that already existed, but the reason they weren't being implemented was powerful special interests were standing in the way. And they were really inspired by Ralph Nader's Action for a Change and founded these student groups across the country where they levied student fees on themselves to hire professional organizers, experts, lawyers, and staff to work on these issues alongside of them. And that's really where we came from, and we really do have roots in that consumer protection side of a lot of the work we do, and a lot of our textbooks work is deeply rooted in student protection, in consumer protection. And we can go to the next slide, and students in the early years of PIRG were not just advocating for changes like recycling deposits and car safety protections, but also doing local research and putting out local consumer guides, which is where the origin of a lot of our textbook work comes from. So think consumer reports, but for what students were actively having to buy and experience, like which grocery stores had the best deal, what do you do when you rent your first apartment, and why are textbooks so expensive? In the early 2000s, the UC Irvine chapter students identified textbooks as an area where special interests were standing in the way of public good. In this case being the fact that 3 publishers control 80% of the textbook marketplace. And students were just not given the same options as they would in other aspects of the consumer market. And a lot of the early research that these students did and really led was more guided by the consumer element. So for example, the tactics publishers used to keep prices high and to make sure that students had to continue buying new books, like releasing new editions every couple of years, whether or not the information had changed. The fact that you could get copies of these textbooks in other countries for much cheaper than you could in the US, and faculty not even having access to the price of the textbooks themselves. And then it was in 2005 when students started advocating for open textbooks and started releasing research and reports specifically on open being the best solution to this broken marketplace students existed in, which the next slide has our first report that starts talking about open, which has a lovely dated cover. Look at those vintage clothes from early 2000s. And this was when open textbooks were really, really in their infancy in a lot of ways. They were referenced here talking about how, you know, there's this new thing where textbooks are being written and released for free on the internet. It's really exciting. We really want to see more of it, but there's just not a lot of options right now. So we want faculty to start writing them and releasing them open, to start thinking about this in a new way. And the truth is students have been part of every single level of advocacy when it comes to open. We can just go to the next slide. From working to advocate for local policies on the campus level, the student PIRGs work to pass things like local textbook grant programs or even state legislation like they did in California in 2012. There was even a campaign where they drove around the country to talk about the textbook issue. And it was that mix of tactics that were very visible that helped really push this issue into the national spotlight in a lot of ways. while people were doing really excellent work, creating these materials, making sure faculty were adopting them, students were really in the forefront and bringing this issue into the public eye. So whether it was local programs like the Rutgers Open Textbook Grant Program, which has so far saved students, I think, like $8 million, which is really exciting, to statewide programs like in California, or even the federal Open Textbook Pilot Grant, students have participated in every single level of advocacy. And it's not just the student PIRGs who are out there making sure that this is an issue. Student governments have been really key as well. So while the student PIRGs are unfortunately the only national student group that work on textbook affordability, student governments have been pushing this at a local level. And on the next slide, there's two examples of this. Oh, excuse me, I got a little bit ahead of myself. And beyond, no, you can go to the next slide. I just got my order mixed up. So as the textbook market has changed, students have really been kind of out in front of a lot of the changes that happen. So when I was a student, I graduated college in 2012. My access codes were CD-ROMs that came in a sleeve in the back of a book. And then within 5 years, those were completely obsolete. So when I talk to people who have been out of school and haven't really interacted with higher education, they are absolutely floored by the way students are receiving information now. The idea of paying $100 for temporary access to your homework and textbook is mind-boggling to a lot of them. But students, because they're experiencing this, are often the first people to respond to changes in the textbook marketplace. So when new ways of delivering and charging students for materials came up, students have been some of the first people pushing back on it. For example, the new practice of automatically billing students for the cost of their books. Some people call it inclusive access or first day access, which are marketing terms. When we released our report and Offer Students Can't Refuse, which kind of breaks down how these contracts work, we wrote that in partnership with a student government activist at UNC Chapel Hill, who not only helped us read through the contracts that universities were making with publishers, but also was a key part in the request to get those contracts to begin with. So not only are students like spreading open textbooks and like the word about open textbooks, but they're often the first people impacted by, and so responding to changes in the textbook marketplace altogether. And now I think I get to talk about student governments. So student governments have been key partners in this across the country. And because their main role is protecting their constituents, the students on their campus, it means that they have been really flexible in how they've been responding to the textbook affordability crisis. So for example, Naomi Riley, who you see on the left, is the student body president for UCLA. She ran and was elected on a platform of supporting open textbooks. And before she was the student body president, she was involved in the academic affairs committee, where she was continuing to push for textbook affordability and really focused on a textbook scholarship to help students in a need-based way, and is now part of a statewide coalition of students who are trying to pass a UC-wide open textbook grant program. And then on the right, you see the Textbook Exchange Network. And this is something I think is really illustrative of the creative ways students respond to this crisis. So the Tufts student government put together an open source website where students can exchange their textbooks and sell them directly to other students on their campus to bring down textbook prices and just make a much better marketplace for students. So not only are they using this open source technology to spread it, but they've been actively outreaching to other campuses to get them involved in their network. And now 6 different campuses are using the Tufts student government platform. And alongside this market-based solution, they're also advocating for open textbooks on their own campus. So student governments, because they're so rooted in their communities, can often respond to very local problems with very local solutions. And they've been part of this from the very beginning and will be part of any student advocacy that goes forward and will need to be included in that. In addition to student governments, on the next slide, you can see that it's not just students independently working, but institutions within universities are now working alongside students and with students to get them involved in open textbooks. You can see this in places like San Jose State University, which has a really exceptional student outreach program where students are at the forefront of communicating open textbooks and textbook affordability issues to other students. They create and plan events and work within the library to create change among their peers. So not only are students working on this from the outside in, but also from the inside out. And very often, textbooks are seen, or open textbooks are kind of seen as we write something for students to consume or learn from. But open textbooks has really changed the game there. And not only are student advocates in this space and activists, but they're also creators. And you're seeing more and more of this as people start adopting open pedagogy. So on the next slide, there's an example from Robin DeRosa, who does some really excellent work at the Plymouth State University Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative effort. So this anthology of early American literature, while she is the primary author, was written in collaboration with almost a dozen students who helped contribute, edit, and really create this work overall. So open textbooks, students are not just involved in advocating for policy change at this point, but they're active partners in creation and not just passive consumers of knowledge, which is one of the things that when I work with students, they find incredibly motivating around open textbooks. So I wanted to really use the words not of me, who's no longer a student, but a student who's actively working on these issues to talk about why she cares. So on the next slide, you see a quote from Prabdeep Rai. She is a senior at UCLA and one of the top people running the open textbook campaign in the state of California. And when I first got involved at UCLA as a campus organizer, she was a freshman. She is a really exceptional student who has just taken on so much leadership over the past 4 years, and watching her grow and take on more and develop her own analysis of not only what problems are impacting her, but what solutions are going to allow for these problems to be alleviated and create the world that she wants to see. It's the reason I do this work. So a lot of people will assume that students care about open textbooks because of the high cost of textbooks that they've experienced. And that is true. A lot of students do care about that for very obvious reasons. But students also care about open textbooks and participate in open textbook advocacy because they care about democratizing information. They care about creating more equitable education systems. And they also care about the idea that education doesn't have to end when they get their degree, but is a continual process that they can go back and continue participating in for the rest of their lives. And open textbooks and open educational resources are a gateway to that. So I do want to just say that like students care about these issues for as many reasons as the people in this chat and in this webinar care about open textbooks. And I encourage you when you're working alongside students to ask them open-ended questions about what they care about and what they want to see in this space. Because the answers that they're going to give should be shaping a lot of the work that we do. So on the next slide, I have some of my information if you want to, so I think that one of the things I just want to touch on really quickly is I've been hearing a lot of people say that COVID-19 has put a stop to a lot of this work. And that's just not the case. Students are being even more impacted by textbook affordability, and the need for open textbooks is even larger than it was in the past. Students don't have access to the internet. Something like 40 million Americans don't have regular access to high-speed broadband. And when classes moved online, a lot of students were just not able to participate in classes. which I'm sure that a lot of y'all have seen or even experienced. And then when materials themselves or homework and quizzes were also moved online, it has completely changed the way students are able to participate in class. I've seen our textbook campaigns across the country and our student PIRG chapters actually explode in growth. So for example, at UC San Diego, where our textbook campaign used to have maybe 5, 10 students, there are now 30 students volunteering on that campaign. So the interest in these issues has only grown since COVID-19, and I expect it to continue to grow in the future. So on the next slide, you can see a little bit of my information. If you have questions or want to know a little bit more about the work that we do, I always like to close these things out by quoting Saul Alinsky. He's a community organizer from Chicago, who said that if you think you're doing something for people instead of with people, you've lost the point of what we're doing altogether. And that has really been the guiding principle in a lot of the things that I do, and a lot of the ways that I approach these issues when I work with students. And I'm not doing it for students. We should be doing these things with students. But that's all I have. And I hope that I haven't taken up too much time.
I don't think so at all. Thank you so much, Kaylin. That was wonderful. And I hope that I hope that everyone agrees or feels the same way I do, that really helps to contextualize this also historically to some extent too, right? Because this does give us the kind of clear, vision of where this comes from, like you said, consumer advocacy and that kind of thing as well. So that aspect of it really helps to, complement the whole, kind of technical open licensing thing and all that stuff. But so I'm just wondering if I didn't see any, I don't know if I missed any. Were there any questions in the chat, or is there anybody who would like to enter a question in the chat for Kaylin when it comes to, anything that she addressed there? Or if you have a question for me from what I said earlier, I'm happy to answer that now as well.
I did not see any questions thus far, but maybe we'll find someone now.
I'm not actually seeing a chat area.
So the chat area for you is going to be a little kind of dialogue looking icon that you'll have to click on, and then that'll open up a chat area to the right. But we'll have more time towards the end, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Thank you, Kaylin, so much, and I hope that you can stick with us in case those questions do, emerge over the next. What do we have left? About almost an hour left, because we have a number of kind of specific details, kind of about how open education looks and practice, and some discussion to have related to that. First, though, I did want to, and Kaylin, I don't know if you maybe want to talk about this current campaign at all or not, but I did want to share this with everybody. This is relatively recent. This campaign, as you can see, Free the Textbooks. This is very much a campaign to kind of unite faculty and students to kind of respond to what Kaylin referenced, the inclusive access practices that are increasingly common, where students are required to purchase usually limited time access to materials, taking away virtually all choice that they have in turn. At least if you had to go buy a textbook at the bookstore, you could shop around, maybe find a used one, maybe split the cost with your family. I, for example, spoke to actually, it was at a community college consortium for open educational resources webinar. Not that I'm just trying to shamelessly plug that, but that we had last year about student advocacy and kind of student workers and stuff like that. And one of the students said that the problem with inclusive access for her was that she was taking a class at a community college at the same time as one or two members of her family, and they couldn't just buy one textbook and all share it. They all had to individually purchase licenses for them, even though they live in the same house and they're doing the same thing, because they can't even access the homework materials unless they spend that money. So it's just an example of the kinds of problematic nature of the inclusive access, and what I've heard some people reference, they call it what it is, which is automatic billing and no choice. So if you are interested, then I encourage you to check out the resources available here. You can see there's a lot of different institutions who are involved in this more recent campaign. Caitlin, is there anything that you would like to add about this?
Yeah, so automatic textbook billing, which is what we call it, because inclusive access and first day access or equitable access are all just marketing terms for automatically charging students when they register for class for the cost of an access code or loose leaf textbook typically. And this is on its face an effort to eradicate the used textbook marketplace and lock in profits for large publishers. There's a number of problems with this. First, just it completely demolishes student choice. As you were saying, if you are automatically billed for a textbook and you have to figure out how to opt out of it, the chances that a student, and in some cases you cannot opt out of it, it diminishes student choice, it diminishes the ways that they can save money. But we also found when we took a deeper look into these contracts that very often they are not necessarily the best deal for the books. In some cases they are, in some cases they're not, but it's very difficult for students to be able to tell. And the other issue that we have with this is that it further entrenches access codes, which charge students to participate in classes that they've already paid tuition for, and really just further entrenches and institutionalizes this practice. So we, alongside of so many fantastic partners on this, primarily OpenStax and Spark, Creative Commons, just doing really excellent work, are trying to draw attention to some of the fine details in the contracts, and that these may not be the best deal for students or the universities and institutions that have signed up for them. So if you want to learn a little bit more about this, I really encourage you to go to freethetextbook.org, read a little bit more about it. And also you can see some more of the information that my colleague, Caitlin Vitez, wrote in her report on inclusive access, which I can put in the chat in a couple of minutes when I hunt it down.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And I would just add as well that if you check out that website, you'll also find that there is a student advocacy toolkit and there's also faculty advocacy toolkit. So, it's really designed to kind of help you, take action in a way that you feel, like is important for, you and your students and the community. So, just check it out, I guess. So, I want to go ahead and move on and transition to a little bit slightly different approach here, because I know some of you are probably thinking like, well, this all sounds great, right? I mean, there's like this idea of free culture and sharing, and that's really important. And by the way, I'd love for everybody to have it in the back of your mind right now, thinking about what is your opinion about like sharing. What do you think of how comfortable are you sharing the materials that you create with other educators? And even the world, right? I mean, that's the big question, something that we're going to ask you to think about and then respond towards the end here today. But as great as all this talk about sharing and saving students money and empowering students and involving students as co-creators and really respecting students as who they are, which is human beings just like everybody else. It's like totally like hopefully interrogating the traditional model where the instructor and the institution is kind of like the keeper of the knowledge and the student is just the newbie who doesn't know what they're doing, and then they're just the container, like what Jasmine Roberts was referencing earlier today at the keynote as well. All of that's great, but is there actually, can we actually kind of demonstrate the efficacy of these practices in ways that are not just, again, saving students money? What about student learning? What about student success and those kinds of things? So I will say that this slide right here reflects a research and data overview as it is created by someone such as myself who comes from a humanities background. Right? So there's like hardly any numbers on this, and there's certainly not a graph here. What I would encourage you to do is I'll talk a little bit about some of these takeaways here and give you a little bit of an overview of what the research looks like. But I would definitely recommend checking out the review project at the Open Education Group website. So the Open Education Group is again, it's a group. I believe they have research fellowships, and they also have this review project where John Hilton at Brigham Young University has been kind of maintaining a literature review of open education research. And this goes back several years, because I remember seeing him present at the 2014, I think, or 2013, maybe 2014, Open Educational Resources Conference in Washington, D.C. And at the time, he was talking about, the cost of, what scholarly research is out there that addresses cost and use and outcomes and perspectives. And there were a relatively small number of scholarly, academic articles out there about this stuff. And now we're not even a decade later, and you will find that it has just blossomed into a hugely vibrant and diverse field of research. I mean, you see research in open education focusing much more on skills outcomes and open pedagogy. You see it not just about like cost savings and use, but looking at things like, the perceptions of the quality of different kinds of materials, and that's how that's impacted by the way in which somebody, what they understand about the cost of the material. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on out there, and I would recommend checking that out. But there are a couple of things that I would say, and this is again, it's not super updated and not super detailed, but there are a few kind of themes that you can identify. First of all, a lot of studies have shown that open educational resources, or what we call open textbooks, are basically at least as effective, as it says on there, as traditional textbooks. So in some cases they are associated with, and it's kind of hard to to claim causality or conclude causality, but certainly there is a correlation in some cases between the use of open educational resources and higher student success and even skills mastery. And there are a lot of reasons why you might see that as the case. I mean, first of all, there is the fact that open educational resources are free, so students don't have to worry about buying them. They are available not just on day one in the course, so students don't have to worry about waiting for their financial aid check and then they go get it. It's just right there available to them, and they get to keep it. Certainly when it comes to perception, this is the second part right here, the perception aspect is also a big deal. Faculty and students typically do really like to use open educational resources. The one thing that maybe sometimes is a little bit lower is that sometimes is perceived as lower quality. And a lot of times that's actually maybe a misconception, and that really only has to do with graphic design and not really content. But again, the general perception is really high, especially for faculty who like to be able to adapt their materials. A lot of faculty, as you might know, a lot of faculty who use traditional publisher textbooks do adapt their materials. They're just doing it in a way that's actually, probably not encouraged, right? In the sense that, if you have your students buy a textbook and it's all rights reserved, and you are like, well, I like this chapter, but I don't like these sections, and so then you want to go in there and cut it up and make it like what you want your student. You're not allowed to do that because it's an all rights reserved material. So the OER actually provides that academic freedom and hopefully, localizes that content so that students will get more out of it. I would also note that there was one study that happened at Tidewater College. There was a Z degree, which is a zero cost degree. So all the required course materials are available for free to students. They found that actually students were taking more credits at a given time. And again, the specific reason for that was not necessarily easy to determine, but the thinking is that, well, if you free up, I mean, how much money if you've taken 5 classes and each one of those classes has a textbook that's $100, and that's you never know how much it is going to cost. Sometimes textbooks are 3 times that. $500 is a lot of money, right, at the beginning of the semester. And at a community college, that's like the cost of an entire course, right? So like what you could potentially see is that students are freeing up that income and putting it towards and reinvesting it in their education and potentially moving them towards completion more quickly. And that's an argument that we can make, but I think that it's something to keep an eye on. And then you can see that there's also associations with better success overall when it comes to certain things, and like students less likely to drop the class at the beginning of a semester or withdraw because they don't have access to materials, that kind of thing. So having said all that, I again do want to reiterate that if you get more details on this, I certainly encourage you to look, do some scholarly research, but of course a good place to start is the Open Education Group website. So at this point, what I'd like to do is hand this over to Maricopa Community College's Open Educational Resources Coordinator. The new one, it used to be me, and now it's Dr. Cyan Proctor, who's here with us today. And she's going to kind of talk through some of the practices of open education, and hopefully not just like how great they all are, but also like what are some of the challenges associated with that. And she's going to solicit some discussion from you as well. So Cyan, please go ahead and take over.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's really great to be here and to share with you some of my experiences with open educational resources and now as the OER coordinator. And thinking back to my history, and what I would like to do is open this up to discussion. So as we're talking about these, feel free to be in the chat and talk about your experiences so we can see and really engage in the discussion about this. But I remember when I'm a geoscience professor, so geology, and I was just thinking back to my classes and in undergrad, how much I had to pay for my math book and my physics book. And I remember one of my vivid memories from undergrad years ago was the week before finals, my physics book was stolen out of the dorm that I lived in. And I was just like, oh no, what am I going to do? But they were stealing textbooks to pay, students would go around and steal each other's textbooks to return to get money. So did you ever have a textbook get stolen when you were going to undergrad because the money was there to, it was a way to get money? And so I remember that in my undergrad thinking how unfair that was, and the incentive to set up that kind of incentive for students to get money that way. And then as a teacher, it was really eye-opening the choices that I had when it came to textbooks to offer to my students at the community college. I started at South Mountain Community College in 1999, and coming from a traditional system, I did what I had been taught. Going to grad school, you pick out a textbook and you use that textbook with your students. And 99% of my students are non-science majors, and here I was making them buy this $150, $200 textbook that they would read a couple of chapters out if I'm lucky, and then they would never open it again. And so that really got me thinking about what could I do with open textbooks and my course to make it so that it was more affordable and equitable to all of my students. And so in the sciences, it's been interesting, especially geology, because I'm going to throw out, a geology a joke here, but we literally move at the speed of geologic history when it comes to adopting new things. So we're on geologic time. But what I found was lucky was thinking about open education in a different format. And that is when we get to Creative Commons, not just Creative Commons licensing, but also what public domain means. And where could I leverage public domain? And being in geosciences, I found that for that space, I was really fortunate because I had resources like NASA for when I taught about the solar system and planetary geology. And knowing that I had these open sources like USGS and NOAA and all of those things, but making that connection that things that are considered public domain and how I could leverage those to make my own textbook for my students. And so that was one of the things that I started thinking about maybe 8, 9 years ago when we started the Maricopa Millions initiative in Maricopa, was how to do that. So thinking about your own history of textbooks and how that has impacted you, and then how your decisions as a faculty member to choose textbooks. Now, I really had to think about when it came to lab, because we have a lab component. And so how do you figure out, how do you create a textbook that, hands-on lab, but images for for education, that's been one of the biggest limiting factors, I feel like, for a lot of the science teachers out there who say, well, I would love to use an open textbook, but what about all of the ancillary things that come with it? And so I remember, you'd get the textbook, but it came with all the PowerPoint slides and all the illustrations and all of those things. And thinking about, well, how do I replace these? It's easy to replace text to some extent because you can write it yourself. But if you're not a graphic designer or artist, how do you get images that you can use and remix and revise and do all kinds of stuff with? It looks like we've got some stuff in the chat coming in. And this was, Matthew, I'll let you read some of the chat stuff. You can just break in if there's something that's interesting that comes up. And you can just interrupt if there is, because it's
no, it's okay. Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah. I mean, it's let's see, who was it? It was Sheila was saying, yeah, she had books stolen as well, and not being able to pay for books in college is such a common experience for a lot of people. And just I was actually about to type a response to her in the chat, but I was gonna say, I not only like try to live in the library when I was an undergraduate, but I abused the computing commons because I found ways to print out as much stuff as possible using the credits that I had. And so like it was funny because I was like taking a class in Old English literature, and this was way before I'd even heard of open educational reading. I was an undergraduate, and I was looking through like the syllabus, and the anthology was going to cost like $140. And I knew as a student, I guess somebody told me about Project Gutenberg, which is if you don't know Project Gutenberg, it's been around since early mid 90s at least. And it's just a repository for public domain books and stuff. And I'm talking Old English literature. There's nothing in that anthology when it comes to primary sources that isn't public domain. And I knew that. So I was printing out like entire, like the whole, Beowulf or something like that, and trying to so it was not super effective, but I feel you on that. I think that a lot of students do. So if we think back, to when we were students, then that really helps us to, have that empathy for what they're going through now, especially because they might not even have the ability to do that. If there's an inclusive access, automatic billing thing going on with them, they can't necessarily just go in there and print it out for free to take advantage of whatever kind of opportunities of licensing there might be. So
yeah,
I wanted to say that.
And I'm amazed about that. I got to preface this that I went to college with a typewriter. So when you're talking about, but access and seeing the digital revolution and thinking about, and I remember, a decade ago being like, why are we still on this textbook that people have to buy when, the digital revolution allows us to do more than that. But also thinking about putting those resources in the library and as a faculty member, what does that do? Whatever you create, making it open and having that access. And then thinking about MOOCs and massive open online courses. And I remember when they first came out and thinking, I was teaching online, and my first thought, of course, was, wow, this is amazing that you can go in and take a course, from MIT or someplace that is just all of this wealth of information. But then the reality of the fact that you can have 10,000 people sign up for a course. And what does that mean as they go through that with the level of interaction and stuff? And how many actually complete a MOOC, a massive open online course? So I'm curious, have you ever done a MOOC, and were you successful in getting through it? And so in the chat, has anybody ever experienced a massive open online course? I know that I have done asynchronous stuff before from like Coursera and stuff. How about you, Matthew?
I have not actually done much in terms of actually, the answer is pretty much no. And in part, it's just because of the fact that, I think I'm just too lazy to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are not successful when they, a lot of people are very ambitious and they get excited about the opportunity to learn, but then it's really a matter of following through, whether you're enrolled in an institution or not, but especially if you're not, because you don't have the additional pressure associated with whatever investment you've made, in the, like, whether it's a cost investment or time and applications and things like that. But yeah, like there are some examples in here, or actually what somebody just said, Paula said, David Wiley's MOOC about OER. There are some opportunities out there. What I like about the MOOC situation is not necessarily that it makes everybody successful, but that it permits, or empowers everybody if they want to be successful. I think that that's really the key, is that it does open it up, and it says, hey, anyone in the world can do this. And there are some institutions, that offer these MOOCs, and if you complete it, then you can actually like pay us some fee and get the certificate or get the credit. So that's a low stakes thing, actually, if you think about it. Somebody could potentially like take a course that otherwise at a university would cost them, a couple $1,000s or whatever. And instead of paying that and risking not succeeding, they can just do it and succeed and then apply for the credit afterwards, which is a more equitable practice. And I think that is actually something cool about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I see somebody saying MOOCs are getting more expensive now. And some folks, there's a lot of good stuff in the chat here, and I encourage everyone to go, because I don't want to just read it all out, but I do encourage you to check out some of the stuff that people are saying in there, because a lot of these experiences are coming through.
Yeah, and especially the one about, Anne says, I haven't taken a MOOC, but I have used their resources to help build courses since they are openly licensed. A lot of it is amazing resources. I have done that myself too. And so a lot of times we think, again, where am I going to find all this information? But luckily, over the last decade, there has been an explosion of information that has been put in the Creative Commons licensing for us to be able to go in and take and remix and reuse and revise to make it just what we need to be able to share with our students. The next thing is this Z degrees, which Matthew had mentioned earlier a little bit about, and this whole idea of that you can go and enroll in a program that you know through the entire program, you're not going to have to pay for textbooks. I mean, that's just like, wait, what? And so this idea of Z degrees, or you can see the different types of acronyms that have been used for this idea or this concept of being able to go to college and not have to buy a textbook. And so I'm really curious, have any of you, or do you offer any of your courses as part of a Z degree? Is your institution thinking about this? And where are you with Z degrees? And Matthew, do you have anything to add about Z degrees?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always have something to add if you want. I would say that I just wanted to point out a couple things. So first of all, when it comes to the language of Z degrees, it's not that it's even the same thing in those are not like a Z degree is not necessarily the same as a zero textbook cost degree or the same as an OER degree. Like they're all actually, there's many different versions and manifestations of this concept in different places. And so, but the general idea is like what Cyan described, is this idea that, you're not going to have to pay for your materials. Now, an OER degree I would assume by definition mean that the materials are primarily open educational resources, permitting, the 5 Rs, whereas a Z degree could rely completely, potentially, on just freely accessible materials that are not remixable. And not that that's a problem. I mean, there's less academic freedom, but there's still the student savings and the immediate access and, all that stuff. That's just something to keep in mind. And ZCred, for those of you who are like, what is that? That's, up north of the border in Canada, if you ask educators up there, they may like let you know that the last letter of the alphabet is Z, and then so therefore ZCred. That's all I got there. So we've got some interesting stuff in the chat here. At least one Rio Salato's criminal justice program is a Z degree. That's awesome. I did not even know that. Thank you for sharing that. Angela, John's working on it. I will say, just as a side note, Scottsdale Community College has some we call them A to Z degrees. So because what we're just trying to think about, well, what do we offer? You know, we have a lot of courses, sections where faculty are using materials that are less than $40. So we call those, you know, the affordable. You know, it's not ideal necessarily, but it's really good, especially if it's a really good material. You know, if I were to teach like a literature class about like contemporary American novels or something like that, and, you know, there aren't that many that are openly licensed, so they have to buy something in order to even really take that class and get that content, because that's just the nature of copyright. But so we have A to Z degrees, which is like a kind of more offerings, but some of those are do involve some stuff.
And then, you know, bringing the discussion to open pedagogy and thinking about the scholarship of teaching and learning and how to be open in that space. I thought that one of the things that with the keynote really kind of opened my eyes today of thinking about the social justice component. Things that I had not thought about that I'm like, oh, you know, because I always think as a science teacher, there's this kind of disconnect to some extent, but now realizing all of the social justice practices that I can include into my, you know, discipline, and thinking about it from an open standpoint, and what does that mean? And so I so much that is spinning in my head from that talk. But when we're thinking about, I'm really curious about what you think about open pedagogy, and also what are some of the obstacles that you might have to wanting to be open and being an adopter and an advocate for OER. And so in the chat, what are you thinking about this? Matthew, do you have anything?
Well, yeah, I would say actually at this point, because we did thank you for you know, helping to go through all this stuff, and bringing up this topic of open pedagogy, you know, really involving students as co-creators in the content, and providing them with, you know, methods and some guidance for understanding themselves as knowledge creators and curators. And I think that, so what I'm starting to, what I would love is actually at this point, you know, these questions are pretty open-ended questions, obviously. What are some other examples of open education in practice that we're maybe not listing here? If you are interested in, even at this point, I think you're able to unmute yourselves. So if anybody, we have time for some discussion, and this is what we'd really like to do right here. So I do see Andrea said, IT courses, networking specifically. I can't find any OER that's sufficient to teach a class. I'm struggling to adapt to any OER. That is, I will tell you, Andrea, just full transparency, that is a huge issue that we have found as well. You know, there are a variety of approaches, obviously, to teaching whatever course you happen to be teaching, and there is, you know, there may be situations in which the discipline that you teach, the discipline that you're teaching, as well as the specific materials that you have identified as important to deliver to your students in terms of learning resources, there might be gaps, right? Because open educational resources don't exist, like they don't just grow naturally. And there are certain situations, this is certainly a common obstacle, there are certain situations where publisher materials, you know, with the resources, the massive resources that publishers have, and just to be honest, like, you know, there's no reason to just like completely marginalize publishers. I mean, the fact is that like some of those materials can be very good. You know, they can go through a rigorous process and all that stuff, and sometimes it's tough to find something that's community developed that actually has the same kind of like, well, at least graphic design, but then there might also be the technical aspects, and sometimes it's not necessarily the content and the knowledge, but the assessment tool that you're using, or because I know that sometimes it's really more about like the technological tool that isn't open, and increasingly I think that that's where a lot of the cost goes. And I think in open education, one of the things that institutions try to have to realize is that OER is not, I did not come up with this expression. OER is free like a puppy. right? I've heard that before. And the reason is that it's like, oh, I love it, but you have to like feed it and you have to keep it healthy and you have to like give it a place to sleep. And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of responsibility involved in maintaining it and sustaining it. And
And I
that
think
cost is a way of offsetting the cost from the student to the institution. And so when we start talking about tools that are not available, then that is something, yeah, that's a challenge. And I think that's one of the reasons why we want to have these collaborative discussions. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking because that was a lot of, but thank you for bringing that up. That was really important.
Well, one of the things that I want to just take a moment to talk about, because a lot of times when it comes to obstacles and open pedagogy and thinking about, well, you know, if you're not sharing it, openly sharing it, is it open? And so when it comes to students and thinking about student work and collaborative development, and it being an open resource, you know, there's a lot of challenges there. And thinking about when and I know Matthew and I have talked about this before, about students, giving students choice empowers them. And so if you want to do an open pedagogy project with your students, how do you navigate that space if students don't want to put their work out there and be open? What are your thoughts about this? Because I'm really curious as to how people feel about that. And Matthew, I'll say, do you have anything? I know you have done stuff with students and student work in that.
Well, I would say that, there are a number of opportunities throughout the Arizona Regional Conference to get into very, very deep discussions and see some practices in terms of open pedagogy. Our keynote next week is specifically about that, as well as we have at least one other workshop next week about open pedagogy as well, and then there's another one later. So there are a lot of opportunities to see some practices, and I'm going to not take over the conversation about that because one of them I'm facilitating. So you can come to that one if you want to see kind of how I've approached it. But what I like to see in the chat here is some of these approaches, right? So one of them is as what where was it here? Paula was saying, right? So that like people are moving, it's like layers. So you start by, you can start the first step. And I always tell people this when they take my workshops, like back in the day, we used to do in-person workshops. But one of the things that I used to try to encourage people to do is not think about transitioning to open resources as some sort of sea change that has to happen in your pedagogy overnight. Step by step, you know, the first step is be open, no pun intended, to looking at an OER and evaluating it just like you would evaluate a textbook to determine whether or not the material is good and that you want to adopt it. Because that, you know, that's the first step. But then, like Paula pointed out, you start to see, oh, well, you know what, I can actually adapt this textbook. Oh, you know what, I can actually have my students do interactive things in terms of adapting the textbook and making those materials more relevant to their lives and giving them the opportunity to provide, you know, cultural background, cultural context that might not be present in those materials in the first place. So it's really, I think, important to think about it like that. It is more challenging, open pedagogy, in a sense, because, you know, a lot of instructors are just used to being the ones in charge. And when you open up your pedagogy, who knows?
You know, I want to address one of the questions that was brought up about, are students capable of contributing so early to, you know, especially in the sciences, to their study and ladder. And for me, I teach non-science majors science. And one of the projects that I've been doing with my students is that I'm all about them doing kind of like their own project-based learning and then sharing it out, and then assigning a Creative Commons license or all rights reserved, whatever they want to do to that. And so I'll give you an example for my planetary geology class. We do a tour of the solar system, and every week the students have to go out and I give them the sites, NASA, and, you know, places to look, but find information and synthesize it. And then they have a set of questions that they have to answer in their own words about that topic. And they do it in a voiced over screencast. And I've got to tell you, and so in their own words and their own understanding, you know, sharing their knowledge about this subject, and then creating something and then sharing that, putting it all together at the end of this portfolio of their knowledge and assigning a you know, a license to it, whatever they want to do, of how they want to share that work, if they want to have it open or not. And it was amazing to see the students' ability to kind of take that information that was open in the public domain and remix it, revise it, make it their own, and then share it back out as something that they have their knowledge and their creation. And so I've had really good experience with doing things like that.
So I also wanted to.
Oh,
Please
go ahead.
I wanted to let you talk. Yep.
So I also, like, I'm not an educator. I'm an advocate and organizer. But when I was a student, I got my degree in archaeology, and I had faculty members who were getting students that were my peers to publish in journals and publish the research that they were doing in formal journals. So if students in the undergraduate level are capable of publishing in journals, and they were, then they can definitely contribute to creating materials that can teach other students. And I know that one of my professors, one of the projects that we did was we were each assigned a archaeological site in the state of Georgia where I went to school. And we were responsible for creating a Wikipedia page for that site and to update that over the course of the year. And those same sites were then used in the next years for future students to continue to add on to and update with new research. So in that case, it wasn't students necessarily creating open materials that would be used, you know, in a formal textbook, but we were creating educational materials that were used to educate the public more broadly. So, maybe, you know, I mean, I'm a bit evangelical about believing in students, but students are smart, they are capable, and I do think they can do it.
I gotta say, my students turned in fantastic work knowing that their peers and others were going to be able to see it. So I was always like, wow. I mean, some of this stuff, and they felt empowered. Some of them to the point where they're like, I want to change my major because I learned so much by doing and going in, and you just giving me the opportunity to figure out the answers to these questions on my own. Without me lecturing to them.
You know, I want to add one thing, and this is in response to a lot of I see in the chat here, and Asmita is bringing up a lot of really good points about just how I think that when, and this is something, again, this is we could have the whole 90-minute session just on open pedagogy, but I think that one of the things that we should remember, though, is that, you know, not all students are going to be able to produce the same quality work. I mean, that's just the case, you know, and so it could very well be that we have to be responsible in thinking about when open pedagogical practices are, you know, the most effective and most appropriate. I think that, like, you know, one of the things that was difficult for my experiments with open pedagogy was that I was teaching English 101 courses, which is the first semester in college, people who are coming straight out of high school or returning to college after a long time, and some people who have maybe even, you know, taken the course multiple times and not succeeded. And, you know, that group of students was not necessarily ready for, like, to be thrown into a self-publishing mode, but making it possible and designing a few assignments that really, as also reflected in this chat, energized the students and got them to think about it, you know, metacognitively. Well, this is not just something that I'm doing for my teacher to get a grade, but this is something that I'm doing that could potentially actually have actual value, and that could potentially be public, even if they're not obliged to publish it. That does empower some of the students who are capable and who are at that level. But I think that it is, Asmita, your points about if they're not always ready, I think that we have to be really responsible about the decisions we make with respect to open pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Matthew. If I may, I just have a concern. I'm so excited about this whole process, and I know from the beginning, since you presented it in the last semester, I've been following you and emails. But I have these 4 things that constantly clash. One thing is the complexity of the subject I teach. I mean, it has math and reading. The other thing is the course content. I mean, as much as we say that Sometimes, you have to look at the student and not the content. Well, ultimately, we have to, at some point, give them something completed. And so that that can be useful for their next class. So content. And then there is always that time factor, and then their underpreparedness. So all these four things being there all the time, some traditional methods seem to be really bringing them up to the discipline and getting them going. Sometimes, I mean, I hate to say this, but if they've paid for the textbook, they are really serious about it and they get to it. But I am also of the opinion that that cannot go out of range. So open education is a great idea. I just don't know how to fit it with these four things. I mean, indiscriminately across all the classes. Like Matthew said that, yeah, I mean, one has to be, judicious where you apply it, but I would like to put it out everywhere. I just don't know how to weave in these four things and still keep it like open. Okay, sometimes you write, I write, and they are going to, I think, not be prepared. And then what am I giving them? So will I again trickle back to the traditional textbook, or I'm grappling with that idea, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say that there are some other responses in the chat. Linda just said, one way to take baby steps with this to at least have your students' assignments shared with their peers. That way it's not necessarily, I think that is an example of ways that you can get the students involved in creating materials that are shareable and that they might invest more work in. But like you said, though, and I think that one of the big issues is the concern that if you don't give the students access to materials that are rigorous and that do accurately reflect the scholarship and everything that's associated with the discipline that you want them to, they can't just make it up, right? They have to know what is required in that discipline and what's
exactly
not true, what works and what doesn't work. So I don't think that anyone is suggesting necessarily that open pedagogy is like throw out the concept of discipline knowledge and let students just make it up as they go. That would be maybe in some cases more possible than others, but like certainly engineering, or I have a lot of people in, like, for example, in nursing who are concerned, like they're like, well, I don't want to let students just like kind of just make the textbook. But remember, part of what we're talking about is not just completely getting rid of the idea of having a collection of information that is accurate. It's just finding appropriate places to more directly involve students in the curation and creation of that. But again, when it's appropriate, depending on the level that the student's at. So, I love this conversation, and I think that I'm just going to go ahead and transition to the next slide, so that I can talk a little bit about the CARE framework. And then after that, we will hopefully have a couple of 5 minutes left over, or hopefully a little bit more if I can get through it quickly, so that we can solicit some of your general thoughts about you as an individual educator. How comfortable are you with sharing, like I said at the beginning? But I did want to share this with you because this is going to, the CARE framework is, the three authors of the CARE framework published this in order to advocate for, a framework that we can use to determine whether or not we are being ethical stewards of open educational resources. So this kind of references or reflects certain trends that people were seeing as potentially problematic in open education, a lot of which we have kind of addressed either to some extent here, also in the keynote today. I know Jasmine also addressed some of the potential issues with that, but there are some other things as well. And so I'll just kind of go through what the CARE framework kind of says. And I see this, so this was interpreted, I think, by a lot of people when it was published as a way to kind of hold people accountable when they were doing things with open educational resources that might be considered problematic or unethical. Like, for example, the commercialization of open educational resources. As we've seen, it can be pretty complicated when we're talking about like a world in which it doesn't matter if it's like the traditional textbook or if it's the new inclusive access thing. The fact is that a textbook, a printed book, has a cost associated with it being put together and printed and delivered and everything, right? And so there has to be some cost for it. And there's always, because we're in a system where the people who deliver those materials and make that happen have the opportunity to make money off of that and raise the price in order to have that margin. And one of the things that some people have seen problematic with open educational resources, at least to some extent, is the way in which some companies can take the open educational resources and package them in proprietary systems that you have to pay for. So you see this with they're relatively low cost alternatives, and so you have some of the publishers like Cengage and Barnes and Noble have theirs, and then you have OER publishers or OER companies, Lumen, for example, which does a lot of work with open educational resources, but also has these tools that similar homework management tool type things that are delivery mechanisms that cost students money. Now, to what extent, I mean, it's certainly not my place. And I would say that, like, in general, I think we would just want to make sure that we are open to having discussions about what role, these kinds of models can play ethically or not, and whether or not you as an individual instructor or as an institution have concluded that it's best for your students to use one of those tools is up to you to decide. But I did want to kind of contextualize that. There was also the idea too that open educational resources and the way that they're developed and disseminated don't always reflect the diversity of people in the world. And as Jasmine was talking about this morning, there is the idea also that a lot of times OER is written by those who are already privileged, with the resources and with the the inherent structure of the educational system to communicate, and then that in itself can be problematic. So those are just a couple of specific examples that come to mind, but what the CARE framework does is it tries to address this some of this stuff and say, here are 4 different ways in which you can really kind of gauge your own engagement with open educational resources and in this space to determine whether or not you really are acting as an ethical steward. So it's not necessarily a framework that I think we need to use in order to determine if a publisher is being unethical, or to determine, if like inequitable practices are being perpetuated. But although those could be the way to use it, but I'd like to see this as a way to just evaluate whether or not the work that we're doing as an institution is our project. Promoting ethical stewardship of OER. So real quickly to go through these things, the contribute aspect is, and I love this concern, where is it here? It says, actively contribute to efforts, whether financially or in-kind contributions, to advance awareness, improvement, and distribution of OER. So it's important to think, this is like the idea that, if all you're doing is sharing your content with your students, you're still sharing open content, even if you didn't write it. But what you're doing is advancing the awareness of it, and you're distributing the OER. That in itself is potentially a great thing, because what you're doing it's inherently promoting it, right, or implicitly promoting it, which is good for open education generally and helps to promote that sustainability. However, you could also interpret this the other way, to say that, if there is a company or an organization that is just simply using the OER for a profit or for some other agenda, but is not really doing it in a way that reflects contribution to the open education community, then you might see that as problematic. The second piece here has to do with attribution, and I think what's really important about the attribution aspect is that word conspicuous there. So it's not just putting the photo credits slide at the end of your presentation with 8-point font. You skip over it in 5 seconds before the question slide. That's not conspicuous attribution, right? You have to remember, with open education, open content in general, free culture, people are sharing their creativity with the world in advance. And the reason why attribution is so important is not just because of provenance, but because we want to recognize the work, the labor, the creativity of that original author. And so conspicuous attribution is that idea that, when you're using a material, when you're adapting a material from an existing source, that you are very transparent about where that comes from and who it is, and not kind of obfuscating in a way that might benefit a potential agenda or profit that you're looking for. And then there's also the last two. The release concept, I think, is really important in that it has to do. And again, I'm kind of providing my interpretation of these things. I encourage you to read the article and engage in the larger discussion about this, how it might be interpreted. But to me, the release component, the R, really has to do just making sure that the content that you're developing is not, and promoting, is not locked up in proprietary systems as much as possible, because you might have materials that are free to your students, and that's great. But then again, if it's locked up in a particular system, that doesn't really promote sharing between institutions necessarily, or even between disciplines. It could, or it, you know, when that's relevant. And it's also kind of like one of the purposes of creating open resources and sharing them with the world is so that people everywhere potentially can value from them or find value in them. And if it's locked up in a proprietary system, or if it's a file type that you have to have expensive software to open or to edit, then it's not really helpful, right? So that ability to, you know, release the content, I think, is an important thing as well. And the last part is the empowerment, and that's kind of what, you know, we've been talking about in a context as well. But the idea that with open education, we have the opportunity and the obligation to make sure that the materials that we're providing, if access and equity are at the center of what this discipline is trying to do, then we have to make sure that we do our best to, you know, kind of support the empowerment of the diversity of voices, and make sure that that's reflected in the materials that we're sharing, and that we're not perpetuating, you know, inequitable systems. So that's that. And I think I am, unfortunately, we only have about 3 minutes, but I would love to hear, I'm going to be quiet. I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts about how willing, maybe put it in the chat first, and maybe one person can have the last word, but how willing are you to share your work with other educators? And how willing are you to share your materials that you've created with the whole world? Because in a sense, if you decide that you want to adopt OER, by all means, you could do it. You just give your students an open textbook, give them a free course, and they're going to like it. But if you decide that you want to share that material, there's obviously other layers of complexity to that. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are in the little time we have left. What do you think about sharing?
I actually have a question about sharing. I was wondering, how do you have conversations with people, the initial conversations about moving to OER? How do you ask, you know, a lot of them really see their course content that they've developed as their intellectual property, and they don't want to give that up. And how do you move slowly through the steps to get them to have a different perspective, or do you not even try?
It's a good question. And thank you, Linda, because I did see your comment in the chat earlier, or your question in the chat earlier, and I'm glad that you reminded me, because this is where it's really relevant. So there's a couple things. First of all, and this is more detail to come at the workshop about Creative Commons, right? Or if you go to their website, you can read about what the licenses do. As the owner of the copyright of a material, you're not giving up your copyright when you put a Creative Commons license on it. If you wanted to release your work into the public domain, that would be different. But a Creative Commons license, you still retain your rights. It's just that you don't reserve all of the rights for yourself. You're just giving some permission to others. And you can do it in a way that you're comfortable with. And so more details to come on that, right? Because we could spend a whole hour talking about the various Creative Commons licenses and what they permit and don't permit. But if you don't want people to sell your work, put a non-commercial, you know, license. If you don't want people to change it, you put a no derivatives on there. If people are concerned about the intellectual property because they are they want the materials to be, you know, consistent, and the academic integrity of it to be in place, or the creative integrity of it in place, that's where you put the no derivatives license. And that way no other people can distribute it and potentially even sell it if you allow it, but they can't change it. You know, they can't publish adaptations of it. And they can always ask you, individually for that. So that's one thing I would say, Linda, is that, like, just kind of let people know that they're not giving up their copyright when they put a Creative Commons license on their material. What they're doing is they're sharing the material in a way that those licenses were designed to work with copyright. They're like, it's like a layer on top of existing copyright law. That's what Creative Commons licenses do. And I would also add to that, if somebody, if somebody doesn't want to share their own materials, there's always advocating for them to, if they're using a high cost textbook, there's always the way that you could potentially bring in something free to support that. But if it is sharing's tricky. I know some people are concerned about sharing as well because there's this imposter syndrome that some people can sometimes suffer from. So they feel like, if I put my work, I share with my students as a relatively limited thing, and I know I'm a human being and I make mistakes. My materials aren't perfect. Share with my students, they'll forgive me if there's a typo, or they'll forgive me if I misinterpret something and stumble over a definition. But if you publish that, then you're exposing yourself in a way that is not necessarily comfortable for everyone. And that's just the reality of that situation. But I would say that that's one of the actual benefits of open education as well, is the opportunity to open up those materials, be transparent about what it is that you think is valuable in terms of your discipline and your approaches. And then when you do that, sometimes you get really, really valuable feedback, and you're able to apply that feedback to make the materials better.
Well, and I think you made a really good point about emphasizing the use of the different Creative Commons licenses, because I think when you're having that kind of a conversation, you're talking more about publishing your work, which, like you said, you do retain your intellectual property, and then people do have to cite you and give you attribution and stuff like that. And that's not always how it's framed. A lot of it's just create this course or whatever, and let's share it with everyone. And there's a certain amount of information people will share, but they also will hold a lot back too.
Well, I just want to say we're a minute over now. Thank you, Linda, for that, and thank you everyone for coming here today. And I hope that you're able to join us for any of the other various events that we have scheduled throughout this Arizona Regional Conference.